committee members. Committee, I would like to acknowledge the fact that we had scheduled this meeting as a result of the Budget Committee meeting today, but I was unaware that they got rescheduled. So I appreciate your flexibility and the unique timeness of this meeting. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll remind you to turn off your devices or put them on vibrate or silent and use the microphones as you speak. And would you please turn in your travel vouchers for today? First on the agenda is the Ford County Clerk. We'll recognize Sam to give the report. Thank you, Sam. And thank you for your quick turnaround on this.
There we are, right? There we go. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee. My name is Sam Dadds. I'm a senior auditor with Legislative Post Audit. Today, I'm presenting our limited scope audit reviewing Ford County's ballot reconciliation process during the 2024 primary election. This audit was managed by Kristen Rottinghouse. The Legislative Post Audit Committee requested this limited scope audit and authorized it at the June 18, 2024 meeting. Our audit objective was to answer the following question: did Ford County have an adequate process for ensuring the number of voted ballots reconciled with the number of voters in the 2024 primary election? The answer to this question is found on page 2. Ford County's ballot reconciliation process did not ensure the number of voted ballots reconciled with the number of voters in the 2024 primary election. So I'll start with some background information that begins on page 2. The Kansas Secretary of State maintains a database of registered voters in Kansas called the Election Voter Information System, or ELVIS for short. ELVIS stores information such as the birth date, registration date, and voter history for registered voters in Kansas. And county election offices use this information to update their poll books for Election Day. Poll books are tools used at polling sites that poll workers use to determine voter eligibility. So after the election, county election officers update ELVIS with the voter information collected by their poll books during the election, such as who voted. And eligible voters vote either hand-marked paper ballots or they use ballot marking devices to vote their ballot. A ballot marking device is simply a device, touchscreen computer, used to mark and print ballots at the polling site. So in most cases, voters cast their ballots by inserting them into a tabulation machine. That tabulation machine counts the ballots using an optical scanner. If a tabulation machine can't read a ballot, it's counted by hand at the county election office. And if a tabulation machine isn't present at a polling site, voters place their ballots in a locked ballot box, and they're counted by a tabulation machine at the election office. This is also where mail-in ballots are counted. There's one polling site in Ford County that doesn't use a tabulation machine because it doesn't have very many voters. So if a voter isn't in the poll book, they sign the provisional poll book, and provisional voters vote provisional ballots, and these are kept separate from eligible voters' ballots. State law requires that as soon as the polls close on Election Day, the supervising poll worker of the polling site must count the number of ballots and provisional ballots containing envelopes, and these counts must balance with the number of voters who signed the poll book or provisional poll book. The supervising poll worker must then report any discrepancies in writing to the county election officer with the reason for the discrepancy. State law only requires that poll workers conduct ballot reconciliation once at the end of Election Day. However, in a previous audit, we saw that some counties do this more frequently. That means ballot reconciliation is ensuring that the number of ballots cast matches the number of poll book check-ins. So our methods for determining our answer and the details of our answer start on page 5. To summarize our methods, we went on site to Ford County's election office and reviewed tabulation machine results tapes and compared them with poll book check-ins for each polling site. We compared those totals with Ford County's official totals, and we checked the poll book reconciliation sheets for accuracy. So Ford County implemented its described ballot reconciliation process and provided evidence showing poll book check-ins and voted ballots balanced at 4 of the 5 polling sites. We saw poll workers at 4 of these polling sites use the ballot reconciliation sheet provided to them by the county election officer. The ballot reconciliation sheets were accurate and included the expected information. For example, we saw that the information on the ballot reconciliation sheets included the counts for the tabulation machine results tapes and poll book check-in records. But at one polling site, poll book check-ins were 1 less than the total number of ballots counted. And this means there appeared to be 1 more ballot cast than there were voters who checked in. So we identified this discrepancy by verifying documentation of totals from the poll book and tabulation machines. And we then reviewed poll book receipts and hand tally sheets one by one to verify this discrepancy. So the discrepancy occurred because poll workers didn't follow the procedures set by the county clerk and state law. From what we can tell, based on the poll book log and the testimony of the Ford County election officer, poll workers at the site appeared to allow an election worker to cast a ballot without signing the poll book. So Ford County uses electronic poll books, so we were able to review the poll book log showing that a worker began the check-in process but never completed it for this voter. And in the poll book log, we saw where the worker made several initial selections in the poll book for the voter before backing out of the required signature screen. The poll book logs don't identify the worker or the reason the worker left the signature screen without the signature. However, poll workers should not have allowed this person to vote because they didn't complete the check-in process. And to be clear, this person was eligible to vote, but they didn't sign the poll book like they were supposed to. So poll workers at the site also didn't complete the ballot reconciliation sheet provided by the county election officer. Instead, the workers had a handwritten tally sheet that they created, and this tally sheet appeared to misrepresent the poll book count because it showed the poll book count matching the tabulation counts throughout the day. It's unclear why the poll workers didn't document this discrepancy between the poll book count and the tabulation counts, or explain the cause in writing to the county election officer like they're required to do. So the county election officer was not aware of the discrepancy until we identified it through our audit work. And this is because election office staff don't check that the reconciliation reports from the poll workers are accurate. The Ford County election officer told us the poll worker who voted without signing the poll book said to her that the poll book malfunctioned and didn't record her check-in whenever they voted. However, the election officer said the worker didn't tell her this happened until a couple of days after the election ended. So the election officer told us that the poll workers should have switched to a different poll book when they suspected there was a malfunction with the poll book. And they should have required the worker to sign a new poll book before being allowed to vote. Based on our review of the poll book logs and activity, the poll book appeared to work properly throughout the election day. So the election officer said she plans to retrain the poll workers and provide them with worksheets they can use to report any voting equipment malfunctions to the election office. There's a short summary of the vote totals for Ford County at the bottom of page 7 if you're interested. We were also asked to check if poll books had the declaration on the signature page required by law, and this information starts on page 8. So county election officers must include specific language on the signature page of their poll books, and generally it states that the undersigned is a registered voter in Kansas. They're signing their own name, and they're qualified to vote. We reviewed the poll books and provisional poll books for each polling site in Ford County to determine if they had the required declaration, and found that Ford County's poll books had a declaration on the signature page, but they didn't have the specific language required by state law. That specific language is found on page 8 in italics if you're interested. To summarize, the language was outdated and it didn't reflect the current declaration required by state law. It included language about being a qualified voter rather than a registered voter, and it was missing the ending phrase found on page 8, starting at, "in the election held on this date." Ford County election officer provided documentation showing they've updated their poll books and provisional poll books to comply with state law as of September 15th, 2024. Because they've already updated their poll books, we don't have any recommendations for that issue. However, we did have one recommendation for the audit, and that's that the Ford County election officer should ensure that poll workers follow procedures for reconciling the number of ballots cast with the poll book check-ins on election day according to statute. That concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Sam. Wouldn't you also recommend that they update the poll book? They did update the.
I did update that, yes.
Okay, so they haven't been following the law for how many years now?
Related to the poll book?
Yes.
We don't know. We don't know when exactly the language was from.
Okay. Committee, any questions? Did you check anything on legal registrants or citizenship, anything of that magnitude? I know you didn't have a lot of time for this audit.
So we don't check citizenship. We used some data from Elvis, which whatever that process is for registration, that people register to vote. We didn't go into that process or anything like that. We've just used what was in the state's records.
Yeah, I think we may need to do a deeper dive at some point. I have a feeling with all of this that there's probably other issues also. Committee, if there are other questions for Sam, we do have the county clerk online for questions. Ms. Cox, are you there? The clerk is not online for Ford County. So she refused to comply with the audit at first until we came in with the second audit. And now she has dropped off and not available for questions. Is that correct? She never even called in. Even though we made it available online, she did not have to drive in. Committee, I guess you'll save your questions for Ms. Cox, and we will explore our options as to what action should be taken. She has disrespected this committee more than once, and I feel that we will look into it. Committee, we're finished with that audit. We'll move on to the next one. Ms. Cox, if you are listening, please be aware we will be in touch. Next up is the Ford County audit. The second one. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon again, committee. My name is Sam Dadds. I'm a senior auditor with Legislative Post Audit. Today, I'm presenting our performance audit reviewing Ford County's procedures for election security in the 2022 general election. This audit was managed by Kristen Rottinghouse. The Legislative Post Audit Committee requested this audit and authorized it at the August 5th, 2024 meeting. This audit included 2 questions. For reporting purposes, we combined questions 1 and 2 into the following. Does Ford County's election office have adequate policies and practices to ensure the accuracy and security of voting machines, storage units, ballots, and devices used to tabulate votes for the 2022 general election? So the answer to this question is found on page 4. Ford County had some security practices that were adequate and others that were inadequate, and it lacked adequate written policies. I'll try to keep the background information brief. Most of this information was presented in our 2023 audit. Because this audit was conducted nearly 2 years after the 2022 general election, we can't comment on the veracity or of the documentation provided, nor could we test or observe certain elements present during the 2022 election. So on page 4, there's basic information about the tools and people involved in elections, such as tabulation machines, ballot marking devices, and poll workers. This was some of the information presented in 2023. The important pieces of information from this section are that election processes vary across counties because of differences related to the number of voters in that county, and that to ensure election security, election workers should carry out all processes in accordance with the policies established by the county election officer. On page 6, we discuss our methods for determining best practices. The important points are that we reviewed Ford County on 55 best practices like we did with the rest of the counties in 2023. We selected 50 best practices from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. These best practices are voluntary guidelines and not requirements. The other 5 best practices came from state law, and they are requirements. That means during the 2023 audit, Kansas had only a few high-level election security-related laws and regulations. Over on page 7, we discuss our evaluation methods for our review. These methods are the same methods we used for each county during 2023. And we also discuss some important caveats that you may want to review. One important caveat is that we didn't evaluate if the controls worked as intended. So in the previous audit, excuse me, our results start on page 8. And in the previous audit, we summarized those 55 best practices into 5 main categories of best practices. We'll go through each one in the results section. But each figure in this section includes subcategories and practices that we reviewed. Appendix B on page 16 will show the subcategories and their individual practices for every best practice area, if you're curious about what goes into each category. Finally, the figures in this report show how practices for Ford County and other counties we reviewed in 2023 compared to the best practices that we had selected. Each figure contains 4 possible shades of blue. The 2 darkest shades of blue indicate that we thought a county's practices were adequate. This doesn't necessarily mean they had no issues, simply that they had at least half of the practices we looked into for each category. And the 2 lightest shades of blue indicate that we thought a county's practices were inadequate. So on page 9, we'll see figure 1. It shows overall process security. That simply refers to the basic practices that set the stage for a secure election. So as figure 1 shows, Ford County generally had adequate overall process security practices. And that was like other counties that we reviewed in this area. Nearly all of the counties we reviewed had adequate overall process security practices in 2023. Over on page 10, we're looking at figure 2. That shows ballot security activity. And ballot security refers to tracking ballot activity. And this category includes things we looked at for Ford County's ballot reconciliation audit that we just presented. So as figure 2 shows, Ford County had a mix of adequate and inadequate ballot security practices. For example, Ford County had process for accounting for vote totals at the end of election day. However, poll workers did not always fully complete the documentation to show the correct number of ballots were cast and tabulated. Many of the other counties we reviewed also had a mix of adequate and inadequate ballot security practices. Figure 3 starts on page 11, and that shows voting and tabulation machine security practices. And that simply refers to securing these machines so they'll accurately reflect voters' choices on election day. So as figure 3 shows, Ford County also had a mix of adequate and inadequate voting and tabulation machine security practices. For example, Ford County had inadequate testing practices before and after the election. They didn't test their tabulation machines return the expected results from a mock election, which state law requires. Conversely, Ford County did have adequate practices for physically securing their machines between elections. So many counties had inadequate testing practices, but adequate physical security practices, and Ford County had stronger practices than several others regarding checking the machines for physical damage when they were purchased. Over on page 12 is figure 4. And figure 4 shows Ford County's election management computer security practices. That simply refers to securing this computer so it'll accurately aggregate countywide results. So looking at figure 4, Ford County's election management computer security practices were generally inadequate and weaker than most other counties. And this is because election officials denied us access to the county's election management system during our 2023 election security audit. So they granted us access to this system in 2024. We reviewed it to confirm it wasn't connected to external networks and that they had no additional software installed. Their system was located in the same locked room as it was in 2023, but we didn't grant credit for the requirement that the election management system not be used for other functions because we couldn't verify the information we saw in 24 was true for 2022. And this is why Ford County scores the minimum possible on this practice. Most of the other counties we reviewed in 2023 had adequate election management computer security practices. And finally, figure 5 on page 14 shows transfer and movement security practices, which refer to securing electronic equipment, election results media, and ballots during transfer from the county election office to the polling places and back. And so as figure 5 shows, Ford County had inadequate transfer and movement security practices. For example, they didn't document how election materials were transferred to polling sites and back to election offices. However, we saw that Ford County did create this documentation for the 2024 primary. And most of the other counties we reviewed had a mix of adequate and inadequate transfer and movement security practices. Lastly, Ford County didn't have adequate written security policies during the 2022 general election. Ford County didn't have written policies or templates for most of the criteria we reviewed. The written policies mainly focused on ballot security, such as poll book sign-ins to reconcile ballots and monitoring the review of provisional ballots. And in our 2023 audit, we concluded that none of the 15 counties we reviewed had adequate written election security policies or guidance. So we had one recommendation for this audit, and that was that Ford County's election officer should continue working with the Secretary of State's office to revise and develop forms and policies to improve the election security processes. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Committee, any questions? Seeing none. On the mock elections, did you actually look at those results that they used? spoken to county before, and they did not give the different candidates different election results. And so they were assuming that everything was fine. And then when the election actually occurred, their machine was not calibrated or coded properly to read the election properly. So I would be curious as to their mock election results.
You're saying that county used a 1-to-1 ratio when they were testing?
They gave the same number of votes.
We didn't look at the ratio that Ford County used. We just looked at the test deck, and the test deck didn't meet the state statute in terms of having a overvote for each of the races, for each precinct. And it wasn't clear, I believe, the way it was explained to me by the Ford County clerk is they're testing the machine's ability to reject overvotes in general, rather than testing to what's in statute.
So we have a clerk that is, you guys, you can hear it. I don't need to repeat it. I know. Senator Thompson.
Yeah, I continue to be a little disturbed by the fact that the clerk's not here to answer these questions. Just simple things like, the transfer of materials to and from concerns me, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, they should be using watermarked paper by now.
I don't know about watermarked paper. When we looked at those criteria, we were looking for things like seals with serial numbers that could be tracked on the paper. So if a seal was broken, it would indicate it had been tampered with, and they could verify that the same seal was intact. I believe for the 2023 audit, we saw that they were using seals, but they didn't have any serial number tracking on it, so we didn't give credit for that.
So if they didn't track that, something as simple as that, if somebody happened to take some of that, they could use that if they knew how to print it correctly and create false ballots. Is that true?
I mean, if somebody got into one of the transfer bags, you're asking if somebody broke a seal and nobody noticed that they replaced it with another seal that looked like it, and they weren't tracking the serial number, they could tamper with stuff. That's possible. That's why they have them track the serial numbers, or they should be tracking the serial numbers as far as best practice.
But they weren't adequately doing that tracking.
No, they were not adequately tracking the serial numbers on the seals.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Committee, the only positive of this is there's not a statewide election this year, so they won't be impacting other counties. But if I was in Ford County, I'd have grave concern over the election coming up. But any other questions for Sam? I can see why they didn't want to be audited last year. But thank you, Sam. I appreciate your work on it and quick turnaround. Committee, we had discussed an audit in November for Ford County. I don't know if we need it or not. We've seen such egregious results. We already know there's issues. Would another audit be worth its time? It would be under 100 hours. I'm going to leave this up to the will of the body, what you would like to do. We had discussed it and passed it, but we did not pass the language because we were waiting to see these audits. If we should adjust the language, and I'm questioning whether you want to continue forward. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Another option, rather than actually voting to have another audit at this point, would be after our general election. Again, sharing this with, let's say, the House Elections Chair, and having them review it and look at any of the laws that we have attempted to change or will change, and they may be able to add to this discussion point on what type of audit is needed, or do we need to change some laws?
That's a great idea, except I don't have the confidence in the House election chairs for several reasons, and I won't go into those in this committee, but I do have confidence in the Fed and state chairman for the Senate for elections. So Senator Thompson.
I was just going to say, if they do share it with House elections, I would like to have it in Fed and state, because that we deal with the House Elections Committee and the Secretary of State too. Some of this is a training issue, I know, from the Secretary of State's office and part of the cleanup bill, but these transfer protocols are very important to me.
Well, I'd say my grave concern too is they weren't even monitoring that the poll books matched the number of votes cast. That in itself is egregious. And I know it was only by one, but it was only by one that was off. It doesn't, the other checks and balances, there could have been more. I give a speech on how important one vote is. Every vote counts. And we have, I mean, we can all look to elections that have been changed by 1 or 2 votes. And this is critical. Senator Thompson.
If I may also, Madam Chair, part of that cleanup bill we passed, I think it was this last session, required backups of the electronic media before and after the election so that they could do some comparisons. And I think this will be the first election we do that, I believe. And so it may be instructive to see whether or not they're following that protocol as well, because that's also going to add to the security that we want to see.
Okay, thank you. Committee, is there any wish to have a November audit for Ford County? I don't. Representative Francis, I'm.
That's all right, Karen.
Go through my mind, Francis. Do you know Representative Air Camp's wife is Shannon?
Yes.
So I go through this little march in my mind every time. Sorry
Understand.
about that.
I just think if there's concerns about election security, we need to make sure the people at home understand that our elections are fair and safe. And I think since there's concerns after we've heard this, that we should proceed with the November audit in this case so that we can assure the citizens of Kansas that we have safe and fair elections.
Representative Tarwater.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And I agree with that wholeheartedly because the whole idea is to reassure Kansans that the elections are fair and safe. But I would say that we really needed to start showing up to some of this stuff or resign.
So if I may, I know this is a little heavy-handed, we've never done it, but this committee still has an option of filing charges against this clerk for not complying with the audit. What I would like the revisers to do is to pull together our options available to this committee, and then we can take a look at that and possibly take action. Would the committee be comfortable with that? But we do need to decide if we want the short audit for November or not at this meeting, because I do not think we will be meeting before November. Representative Sawyer, then Representative Williams.
Yeah, I think based on how poor a job they've done, we ought to do a November audit, just see if they made any progress at all or see if it's gotten any better. I mean, this is pretty egregious, and I think we ought to do it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So is the question and the audit identical to the one that we just reviewed?
So that's the key. That was my next question. We'll take a vote. I think we will, all those in favor with proceeding with the November audit, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Motion carries, so we will proceed with that audit. Now the question is, do we change anything or do we do the same audit? I think we should ask a few different questions because they know what we're looking at now. So I think we should, and maybe Sam might have a couple of suggestions on that, or Kristen, as to what we should change in the audit. Senator Thompson.
First and foremost, I think I'd have a formal notification so that they can't do what they did last time and seal up documents into a bag where we have to go through this whole process again. So they have to acknowledge that they know this audit is coming and all the available materials should be ready.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. That is a great idea. They did comply with the 2024 primary audit. So we will make notice of the general audit. And I'm sure they are aware of that because it was passed prior. But thank you, that is a great and excellent comment. We do not want to have to go through that again. So any other suggestions on changes to the audit? I think I would like to see something on valid voters. If you could spend a little time on that, Sam. I don't know. Yes, please.
You say valid voters?
Yes, if, well, it just bothers me that the numbers are off. So if you would check the mock election status, check the numbers that were actually used, look a little closer at that. Any other suggestions, committee? I do know that we have an issue with immigration down there. We welcome wholeheartedly legal immigrants, but we want to make sure that non-citizens are not impacting our elections also. So if there's anything you could do on that.
I think generally, if we were looking at something like that, we would have to rely on what's in the voter registration documentation. So that would be whatever's in Elvis at the time of the election.
Yeah, that probably, you won't be able to dig deep enough on that, but if you can, it might be worth looking into. I heard today a state, I thought it was interesting, Georgia, that if you think somebody is not living in the county that they're registered to vote, you can actually challenge their vote. I thought that was interesting. Kansas doesn't do anything like that, but it may be something to consider in the future. Committee, any other suggestions on the audit that we should change though, or are you comfortable with the? Senator Thompson.
Are we talking about an audit, post-election audit in November?
November,
Okay.
yes.
So I guess maybe ensure that any of the new cleanup bill statutes that we had passed are also being included, that they're following that new state law. I don't know how many would impact, but fortunately my fantastic revisor from Fed and State is here, and so he may give us some guidance on that.
No, that is a great idea to make sure that they are complying with the law. It seems like they're not in several places, so especially the new laws that passed. Anything else? I know we have to keep it under 100 hours, but. Okay, committee, so, Chris?
I was just going to inform the committee, by committee rule, the committee can conceptually approve an audit and give us general direction. From this point forward, we will put together a proposal and send it around for any comment or feedback, that sort of thing.
That would be great. So we will take a vote on it. All those in favor of the conceptual audit, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your work. Committee, our next is the tax increment financing report. Welcome, Kate.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm here to present the audit estimating the economic impacts of tax increment financing districts, which was approved in April of last year. There were 3 questions for this audit. The first was, do tax increment financing, which is abbreviated as TIF, do TIF projects recover their costs timely? The second was, how do the estimated economic benefits TIF projects create compared to their estimated costs? And the third was, what are the estimated financial effects of TIF projects on school districts? So we'll get into the details of each of these questions and answers in a little bit. But I'll begin with the first question about whether TIF projects recover their costs timely. And just as a broad answer to that question before I get into details, we found that 3 of the 6 TIF districts we evaluated did not recover their costs timely. So we'll go ahead and start briefly on page 4 of the audit report. Sorry. We'll cover what a TIF district is and how it works. TIF districts were first authorized by the Kansas Legislature in 1976. They're essentially an economic development tool that cities, who are the sole administrators of TIF, can use at their discretion. A TIF district is a defined area of land within a city. It's usually a few city blocks in size, and it utilizes a special funding mechanism to incentivize some kind of development. In most cases, a private developer is responsible for doing some agreed upon development, and the city agrees to help pay for some of the costs of development. And the development that occurs, that's generally referred to as the TIF project. So the TIF district is the area of land, and then the TIF project is the plan for development that occurs within those district boundaries. Now, I spoke of the funding mechanism. How does it work? Basically, when the TIF district is created, the valuation of all property within the district is, at that time, it's effectively frozen and recorded as something called the base assessed valuation. So in subsequent years, while the development is ongoing, the tax generated on the property valuation above that amount is known as the tax increment, and that is distributed to the city exclusively to use to pay for their TIF costs. Tax generated on anything below that amount is distributed to the usual subdivisions like the county, the school district, et cetera. And the reason it works this way is because the basic premise of TIF is that future increases in tax revenue that are brought about by the development can be used by the city to help pay for their costs. And you can see a visual representation of this in Figure 1 on page 8, which can hopefully make it a little bit clearer. And real quick, I'll just mention briefly that the financing part of tax increment financing district, cities have flexibility in how they choose to use the tax increment to finance their TIF costs. The two primary ways are pay-as-you-go agreements and the sale of bonds. With pay-as-you-go agreements, the city collects the tax increment every year and then reimburses the developer for the eligible TIF costs. With the sale of bonds, the city will sell a bond up front and use that revenue from the bond to pay its TIF costs. And then the property tax increment over time is used to pay back the bond with interest. And you can read more about these at the bottom of page 6. I'll turn to page 9. On page 9, there is no central list of TIF districts. There's no state agency responsible or required to track them. And so to gather a list, we had to contact cities directly. We surveyed the 10 largest cities in Kansas by population and asked them to list for us all the TIF districts they had created, including currently active TIF districts. And on page 9, figure 2 there, the number of TIF districts by city and the decade of their creation is shown. We cover, we ended up selecting 6 TIF districts to evaluate. So we'll cover the audit objective, the first audit objective, but the 6 districts we selected were the Melrose TIF district in Kansas City, the College Hill TIF district in Topeka, the Douglas and Hillside TIF district in Wichita, the Lamberts district in Salina, the Kenmar district in Wichita, and the Valley View district in Overland Park. So just as a quick reminder, for the first objective, we were tasked with evaluating for each of these districts whether they recovered their costs timely. So we compared city estimates for things like, how much the TIF project would cost, how much revenue it would take in, how long it would take to develop. We compared that to what has actually happened thus far in those TIF districts. So on the top of page 12, we start to present our results for that work. And we found that 3 of these 6 TIF districts are either not expected to pay off their TIF costs on time, or they have not generated enough tax revenue to pay off those TIF costs. So these 3 districts were the College Hill district in Topeka, the Kenmar district in Wichita, and the Douglas and Hillside district also in Wichita. And figure 4 on page 13 shows a comparison of the costs and revenues for all 6 districts in our sample. And just as an example, so the College Hill District in Topeka, it is expected to pay off its TIF costs on time. So the city is expecting that they will pay off their costs according to their estimate. But that's because the city has had to use other general city funding to help essentially cover the shortfalls in TIF revenues. So we'll turn to page 14 now. And we'll cover more about like the timeline of development stuff. We found that for all 6 of our selected TIF districts, they are on track to come in at or below their estimated costs. But most of these districts experience delays in construction and have taken longer to complete than originally planned. So these were the College Hill District again in Topeka, the 2 Wichita TIF districts, and then also the Valley View District in Overland Park. So with all of these pieces, just in summary, and as I mentioned earlier, altogether, half of our 6 selected TIF districts did not recover their costs timely. I'll turn to page 15 now, and we'll start looking at the second audit objective, which was how do the estimated economic benefits of TIF districts compare to their costs? And I'll start by saying that with the limited data and time available to us, we could not make a direct financial comparison between benefits and costs. The primary cost of TIF districts is the direct financial cost that the cities have to pay for their portion of development. And there can be a variety of benefits, which we'll cover in a little bit, depending on the type of TIF project and what the city's goals for the development were. So rather than try to measure benefits against costs, like an apples to apples comparison, we decided to conduct a variety of analyses and try to demonstrate some of the benefits that TIF districts can have, as well as potential additional costs beyond just the direct cost. And just as a note, Appendix B has more details about our methodology and more information about the analyses. I'll just mainly hit the highlights of each of the analyses right now. So we spoke of direct financial costs for the 6 TIF districts in our sample. That ranged from $1.6 to $7 million. So that is the amount of money that the city has paid for TIF costs. That's either direct reimbursements to the developer or in paying back bonds or a combination of both. The first analysis we conducted was an analysis of crime rates. So earlier we had conducted a literature review and discovered that there's some literature that suggests that TIF districts can have additional indirect costs, generally from increased demand from public services such as police, fire department, infrastructure, things like that. So in an effort to try and measure that, we figured we'd look at police reports. And so using police report data from city police departments, we evaluated changes in crime rates from before and after the districts were created. And on page 16, we present these results. We found that for 4 of the TIF districts in our sample, they experienced increases in crime rates after TIF development. And generally, this increase was primarily driven by increases in property crime like shoplifting. This makes sense because increased development, especially if it's commercial development, may bring about additional opportunities for criminals to commit, shoplifting, vandalism, those kinds of things. And it's possible, just like what I talked about with the literature we reviewed, it's possible that these additional reported crimes also resulted in an increase in public services and public service costs to the cities. But we were unable to measure this in dollar amounts because there's just no data available that would allow us to do that. And just as a quick note, we were only able to do this for 5 of our TIF districts. We weren't able to analyze crime for the Melrose TIF district in Kansas City due to a lack of data. So next, we analyzed property value and tax growth in the TIF districts in our sample. And we compared the actual growth in property value and tax to what we estimate would have happened if there had been no TIF development at all. So these results begin on the middle of page 19. For 5 of the 6 TIF districts we evaluated, we found that property values and property tax revenues increased well above what we estimate would have happened without TIF development. And this is shown in figure 6 on page 20. So just as an example, After TIF development, the Valley View District in Overland Park had a total assessed valuation of $2.6 million and an annual property tax revenue of $260,000. If the TIF development had not occurred, we estimate that the property assessed value would have only grown to about $500,000 and only generated about $50,000 in annual property taxes. Next, we analyzed how property values and major structural developments in neighboring areas changed after the creation of the 6 TIF districts in our sample. So using tax data, we found that for properties bordering the 6 TIF districts in our sample, those properties experienced increases in property value growth rates after the creation of the TIF district. So for example, in properties bordering the Kenmar TIF district in Wichita, the annual growth rate prior to the TIF district was -1%. And after the TIF district was created, it increased to positive 2.6%. And further, in addition to looking at taxes, we used historical aerial imagery. And we found that for, again, 4 TIF districts, the rates of major structural changes that could be seen from an aerial view increased after the TIF district was created. And all of this information and these changes are shown in more detail in Figure 7 on page 22. And lastly, for this objective, we were able to evaluate changes in employment for 5 of the 6 TIF districts in our sample. We were unable to evaluate employment for the College Hill district in Topeka because businesses within that TIF district did not report job numbers to the Kansas Department of Labor, and so we were unable to look at their job numbers. But overall, we found that for 4 of the 5 districts that we were able to analyze, they experienced increases in employment numbers after the creation of the TIF district. Due to data confidentiality concerns, we can't report the specific values of those numbers, but we can tell you that they did increase employment. So just as a summary for Objective 2 here, there do appear to be benefits from TIF districts, a variety of benefits such as increased property taxes, increased property values, and increased employment. But there can also be additional costs in addition to the direct costs paid by cities, and these additional costs can be from things like increased public services, increased police demand, things of that nature. Whether or not these benefits are worth the TIF costs it's somewhat subjective and can depend on the specific project or a city's overall goals. So for example, some city officials told us that the achievement of the project goal itself, something such as bringing in a new grocery store to a specific area, that in and of itself they see as a benefit regardless of what the actual financial costs are. And now we'll move on to the third audit objective, which is evaluating the effect on school districts. I'm on page 24 now. This question again was, what are the financial effects of TIF on school districts? I'll cover this kind of briefly just for the sake of time and because it's a relatively straightforward answer. But just as a quick recap, school districts are affected by TIF because of how that property valuation is frozen when the TIF district is created. So the school district's portion of property taxes within that district are also frozen for the duration of the district and cannot increase in that area. So the main takeaway of our finding for this objective is that the 6 TIF districts that we evaluated were just too small physically and financially to have a significant negative or positive impact on school districts. So in all cases, the annual amount of foregone tax revenue that the school districts endured was less than 0.04% of their annual expenditures. We also analyzed enrollment to see if TIF had potentially any impact on enrollment and were unable to detect any impacts of TIF on school district and enrollment. So, and very lastly here, I'm on page 28. We identified a few other findings that might be of interest. So first, there is no central repository or list of TIF districts, and statute does not require that cities or any other government entity track outcomes or data for TIF districts, and this can make it difficult to evaluate economic benefits and costs. Next, a change in the TIF Act in 2001 altered the timeline for tax increment collection. With this new change, cities can now create a TIF district and begin to collect that property tax increment without an active project, so without an active development or a plan for development. And so this means that there's also no deadline for the creation of a TIF project, and so this means that a city could theoretically collect tax increment funds from a TIF district indefinitely before beginning actual development. And then last, we did find at least one instance of a city calculating the tax increment, the property tax increment, in a way that appears incorrect, although the statute is somewhat vague on how the calculation is supposed to be made. So that concludes my presentation. There's a lot more information that I didn't have time to get into in the report, but I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Cade. Committee, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So 2 questions. Number 1, when we're looking at the statute without me doing a search, what statute includes the TIF?
The number, I'm not sure of the number off the top of my head.
And that would be one of my requests in the future, that whenever we have an audit of any kind, always put the statute with it so that we have an ongoing quick reference. We don't have to kind of go search for that, because I can, that'd be extremely helpful. And then my last question is, as we look at it, it says that's, okay, it says ultimately pays for itself. So we know that that's the goal, and we have this partnership between our cities and our developers. But in 3 of the 6 cases, the money that should have helped pay it off was not there. So I am then making the leap assumption it's not really a partnership then in statute. One has to make up the difference, the other, which would be the developer, does not. Would that be a fair assumption in the sense that the money that was supposed to have been gained, that tax increment, wasn't realized in that area? So therefore, the taxpayers had to come in and save that investment. Would that be in a correct?
Yeah, I think you're close. So you're right in that for 3 of the 6 TIF districts, we found that the tax increment that the city was collecting was not, or has not been thus far, sufficient to pay for the TIF costs. But when the city and a private developer enter into an agreement to develop a TIF district, there are aspects of the development that only the private developer does. So there's some, in the TIF statute, it restricts what the city can pay for. So the private developer is usually the one building the actual buildings. The city usually pays for things like utilities, infrastructure, stuff like that, purchasing land, things of that nature. So the private developer has to do their portion of the deal regardless. The city will help pay for the portions of the development that the city is allowed to pay for. And those portions are the ones that in Figure 4, for example, we're saying that 3 of the 6 districts are behind or have not generated enough revenue to cover that cost.
And so real quick, in the, in statute, they have to do a, let's say, an economic impact review or study, so they know kind of assessing how much money is supposed to be made, and they just didn't do it well.
Correct, yeah. We compared their estimates for how much revenue they thought they would generate compared to what actually happened. And in those 3 instances, it's lower than what they estimated, which is why they're behind.
Okay, thank you.
Jason, and then Senator Thompson.
Madam Chair, just for the committee's information, the TIF statutes begin with KSA 12-1770, and there are a number of statutes following that detail procedures and requirements for creating a TIF district and managing the projects.
Thank you, Jason. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions. Is there an average length of time for a TIF district, 10 years, 20 years? Is that what you used for considered paid off timely?
Paid off timely, that's comparing to what they had estimated. So whenever a city is about to create a TIF district and project, as Representative Williams mentioned, they have to do an economic analysis and put together a project plan in which they estimate what, they tell you what they're going to do, how much revenue they think they're going to generate, how much it's going to cost, and then how long it will take to pay off those costs. So we compared what has actually happened to what they were estimating. In terms of length, I don't know that we looked at an average length of TIF district or project, but a TIF district has a maximum length or the TIF project has a maximum length of 20 years. So when the city approves a TIF project, it has 20 years to complete before the tax increment financing thing reverts back to normal taxation. So there is a limit on that.
Okay, and so if the developer is out of the picture, they've done their due diligence, they built the buildings and everything like that, are part of the calculations, and the part that concerns me the most is the costs that we can't estimate, the indirect costs, the opportunity costs, particularly indirect, because in 20 years, a developer may have been gone for a long time, but you also still have to maintain the roads and the infrastructure that was built up for that particular district. There's no good way, or is there a good way to calculate that? It doesn't look like it based on this audit.
Yeah, we were unable to calculate that, and we're not aware of any data set that would track that. But you're correct that the literature we reviewed, and the crime work that we did suggest that there are other indirect costs to the city specifically, but those are very difficult to calculate.
One more, Madam Chair, if I may. And what you talked about, cities using this for blighted areas, but I know in Shawnee, for example, there's a lot of undevelopment, basically rural area in the western part of the city they're using TIF districts for. And my concern is that you talked about it increases the property values out in those areas. But then in a lot of cases, you'll also have existing homes in those areas that are older homes, and all of a sudden, these residents are experiencing massive increase in valuation that they get taxed on. Is there any consideration about the impact on the existing homes in that type of situation? It's not blighted, it's just undeveloped.
We didn't, if you're asking about impacts on homeowners, we didn't evaluate that, but one of our analyses for Objective 2 suggests that at least I think it was four of the six TIF districts we reviewed, land bordering the TIF district also increased in property value growth rates. So that is something that we saw, yes.
Hey, good, excellent work. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So all of the TIFs that we saw today, did they all include land acquisition as part of the development costs, or do you know?
I know some of them did. I don't think all of them did, though.
And then when they start to run behind, is there anything in statute or in the development agreement that allows the city to accrue interest on upfront costs that they haven't realized yet, or do they just have to eat those?
So if the city, so like I said, there's essentially two different ways the city can finance it. There's not only two, but those are the two big ones. One is pay as you go, where when the developer does the city's portion of the development, so when the developer puts in the utilities, the infrastructure, what have you, the city will only pay them when they generate the tax increment. So there's a bit of protection there for the city, you could say, because if the development doesn't raise property taxes like they estimate it's going to, well, then the developer may only get paid whatever the tax increment is. But what you're talking about, it sounds like, is the sale of bonds. So that happened in a lot of cases that we saw. A city will take out a bond right away, use the proceeds from the bond to pay the developer and pay for their part of the development immediately. And then over time, they have to pay back the bond, and that the bond can accrue interest, which they may be accruing over time, yes.
I guess my question was more, like, let's use the Kinmar, I think, example where I'm trying to make sure I'm looking at the right one. Well, I'm trying to find one of the ones where where they're really behind as far as the increased valuation repaying the costs, and they're having to use city funds to supplement their payments. Is there any way that if they've just got out-of-pocket costs to cover some of these things, that they can put an interest rate on it?
If they have a bond, there will likely already be an interest rate.
And they can count that, but if they just pay for it, they
If
just have to wait till they get the money.
I think we did see a case where the city and the developer had entered into an agreement where the developer would front all of the costs, the city would pay for their portion of the cost, and they would pay the developer an interest rate. But, I mean, the city really only has when they create a TIF district, the developer usually gets to work pretty soon, and so the city has to start paying for those costs right away. And so that's why a lot of cities take out a bond, so they have a pool of money ready to go to reimburse the developer right away. So in that case, there's an interest rate. There can be an interest rate with the developer, but other than that, I don't know what other interest rate there would be for the costs.
Representative Sawyer.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the two Wichita ones. On your chart, it shows they're considerably behind, but it's even worse because that includes some money from the city. Do we know the amount that the project itself is generating in those two cases?
You're talking about the amount that has come from the property increment?
Yeah, because when I look at like Douglas and Hillside, it says 910,000, but there's a little pink there.
Yeah, that's the total amount. That includes some funding from the city or other
My question
funding.
is, do we know how much?
Yeah, the blue bar portion, we could send those to you. I don't know those off the top of my head, but we could tell you the exact amount that has come from the property or the tax increment that has come for.
On both those projects, the amount that's come from the project itself looks pretty bad.
And I would follow up with that, Representative Sawyer. I'm somewhat actually surprised at the conclusion drawn by post-audit on this, because we do look at several cases, and 3 out of 6, 50%, are being funded by other sources, so the program's not working. So I'm definitely surprised at your conclusion. I do have a couple of quick questions, though. Senator Thompson.
Just one, Madam Chair, and I think he kind of pointed this out. There is no central database for any of this, and I think we've been asking for a long time of some accounting of economic development programs in this state, and it would be nice if we asked the Commerce Department to include this so that when we're looking at all the various communities, it becomes much easier for our budget people to see what kind of burden we're putting on the taxpayers, because these TIF districts, add on to the tax burden that we also have with other things. And so I would really love to see a database developed to keep track of this.
And it would definitely help our local governments make these decisions, and Representative Williams has been a diligent fighter on this issue. Representative Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So we are going to have to go back and take a look. I know Representative Tarwater as well in Commerce, because we have not been satisfied with the economic taxpayer transparency database. In fact, it's supposed to have property tax abatements. It's not there. And so, yes, we should have the TIF districts as well. But in addition to that, we don't know the total amount for every program. And we've asked that from Commerce even last year. How much total have we spent in economic development incentives, whether it's sales tax for the STAR bonds that we use annually, or whether it's tax credits? We don't have that number unless you want to pencil through all the, 1,000 different options for every program inside the database. So I'm very disappointed that we still don't have that number. And I do think that's required in statute. So yes, Madam Chair, it'll be something we'll be looking at.
Thank you. And I just recommend we put some financial teeth in there, that we start clawing back when that database is not available and the resources are not available. Thank you, Madam Chairman. She will be chairing that meeting, right? Okay. Oh, it's, I'm sorry, it's Chairman Tarwater, so, okay. Okay, thank you. You're right, we are in a transition year. We have no idea where we're going to land. So I will ask on page 13, Salina and Lenexa, it looks like they took advantage of or participated in the program early, but they have not continued to participate. Has there been any research on that as to why? If you look, the heavier projects were the darker blue, if I'm reading that right, the property. So did you do any research as to why those communities have chosen not to continue with this program? Or was it not of benefit to them?
No, we didn't ask them that, and we didn't ask them if they're planning on continuing with the program or not. The figure 4 there, the dark blue represents property tax increment revenue, and the light blue represents sales tax revenue. So in addition to property tax increments, cities can also use sales tax from the district to help pay for costs. And so Salina used it for Lambert's, and Overland Park used it for the Valley View District, which is what's shown in the figure. But no, we did not do.
The actual figure I was looking at for these numbers is on page 9. 13 shows the dollars amount. And I was going to ask you, the pink is where they're having to go to other sources other than sales tax, which demonstrates that the TIF program as is not funding these projects. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. When the city creates the district, they can decide if they're planning on using property tax increment, sales tax increment, a combination of those things. So Salina and
I can guarantee you if they're using property tax increments, that if they were in my district, their constituents would be extremely upset. Right now, property taxes is not the way to go on any program. But if you look on page 9, it demonstrates that most of these were prior to 2009. So I question your results again. I'm just curious because we have cities that are no longer using the programs. We have evidence that crime rates increase and other costs increase, and that they're not, 50% of your results showed not the objective of the program. So I don't want to put you on the spot. If you want to think about that and get back to the committee, that would be great.
yeah. Are you asking if the cities are planning on continuing to use TIF?
Asking why your results are basically, I don't, you question the return on investment, that you weren't able to calculate that, and that it's difficult to calculate a benefit cost ratio or return on investment for the TIF. I don't think that it is based on the information in your report, but that was your conclusion.
Yeah, so what we mean by that is it's difficult to put all of the possible effects of TIF into the same box and put a dollar value on it and then calculate like an ROI or a but-for percentage. Just because there's so many different things that can happen with property values, sales tax, crime, jobs. There's a lot of potential, ancillary effects that can occur. So we evaluated potential benefits. We looked at jobs, we looked at property values, we looked at those kinds of things. And then we looked obviously at the financial costs. But again, with a lack of data, without a central source or data requirements to be tracking, if cities don't track data like that, we can't really put numbers on everything. And so, yeah.
Okay, and I do appreciate that you selected districts that are not using IRBs. That helped greatly, so it's much appreciated. The other thing I would ask was, well, the crime rate, I thought that was intriguing. Did you do an estimate? You did on the property tax, the increases on it. Did you do an estimate on if the crime rate would have continued to increase in those areas?
So we didn't evaluate the rate of change of crime rate from before and after. We just evaluated the crime rate from before the TIF district and compared it to the crime rate to after the TIF district. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you very much. There's a lot of information in this report. Just a second. Is there any more questions for Cade? Seeing none, thank you, Cade.
Thank you.
We do have the USDA 501, Kansas City, and Topeka are here if there are any questions. And yes, if you'd like to. Yes, if you would like to come forward. Please state your name and.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you. I'm Mike Scragg, city manager in Salina, Kansas. I've been either deputy city manager or city manager since 2005. So I was directly involved with the Lambert's project, and as you asked why we haven't pursued other TIFs, I thought maybe I ought to speak up. So That particular project was on our main corridor. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Salina, but 9th Street is kind of our main, I'm sorry.
Just ate there yesterday.
So our main corridor of 9th Street, the Lambert's addition, developed a vacant piece of ground that was blighted with drainage problems, and it was really just kind of a slough that stood water, and we couldn't get any development interest. And so we had a developer that approached us. We saw TIF as a possible tool to kind of break the market forces that were causing that property not to be developed. We do, when we use incentives, our first go-to is pay-as-you-go to, my typical response is, if you believe what you're telling us, then pay-as-you-go financing shouldn't be a problem. In that particular case, we did bond finance it. Just a couple of other observations with respect to crime rate. I'm confident our crime rate went up because it was a vacant grass lot previously, and now it has commercial development, Kohl's and Shoe Carnival and Buffalo Wild Wings and Longhorn Steakhouse on it. So it went from no activity to quite a bit of activity. With respect to school district participation, one thing that I think may be of note is school districts and counties have veto authority over TIF districts, and so we need their permission to proceed with a TIF district. Makes it a very local conversation, and in our particular case, that's a conversation I have with the school superintendent, the county administrator, and then their elected officials as needed. TIF has been effective for us. We have, as we've tried to address some challenges that I plan to speak to in my Star Bond comments, we tried to just inventory every economic development tool available to us and then target its use. We've used other tools. RHID is very similar to TIF, and we've used that heavily recently. The planets haven't aligned essentially to make TIF necessary for us again recently. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you like.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. You made one interesting statement. I'll rephrase it basically. So if there's no demand for usage of land or developing that land that exists without government action in the form of a TIF, are we really gaining anything? Because nobody wants to take that risk unless the government, or let me rephrase it, the taxpayer is involved backing them up.
So I can't speak for every community. In our particular case, that location was prominent, it was an eyesore, and it was a blight on the corridor. So we felt like it was hindering the development of the rest of the corridor. And if we could solve that particular issue, that it had an overall positive effect for not just the community, but ultimately the tax base.
How big of an area was that?
6 acres, something like that. It would be my guess. I don't know off the top of my head.
Would it been for the taxpayers more efficient to clean up that 6 acres and be done with it rather than turn it into a TIF? I'm just trying to get an essential idea.
Those are the kind of conversations we have with our city commission on a regular basis. And for us, we viewed it as kind of a delayed gratification in terms of we make that initial financial commitment so that we can get it on the tax rolls and collect taxes in year 11 and thereon. If we hadn't used the TIF approach, we probably wouldn't have a development partner. We just would have prospectively been trying to solve a private development issue in hopes of then going the rest of the way. When you're able to kind of make it a development project with a partner, you have more certainty that it's eventually going to come on the tax rolls and be received.
Got it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Any other questions? No. And I frequent Salina quite often, so.
Have you been to our downtown?
Yes,
All
I was
right.
just there. We spent quite a bit of money, actually. But what's interesting, and I'll get off topic just really quickly and get on, what we were talking about, Salina, is the downtown, when I was growing up, was very active. The mall was a little bit active out south. Now, they've got 2 mall areas that are not, they're dying out, and the downtown's growing again. So it's like you're cyclical for some reason.
I don't want to sidetrack too much, but the whole mall concept, people have moved away from that centralized mall, and they're making malls outward facing. It's just kind of an odd dynamic that we find ourselves dealing with.
No, but nice community, a lot of family there, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. So Thank you. Committee, are there any questions for 501, Topeka, or Kansas City? Seeing none, thank you guys for being here today. Appreciate it. Committee will continue with the next audit. Star bonds, Andy. Boy, you get the fun one.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. This is an economic development incentive evaluation that we did under the statute that until very recently required us to do these on an ongoing basis. And if you flip to page 2 of the report, you'll see the question that we answered, which we chose on our own underneath this statute. So it is, do star bond districts increase local quality of life amenities? And what effect do those amenities have on college graduates in Kansas? And I will get to the logic behind that in just a moment. But before we do, let's go to the top of page 3 and look at the answer. So we found that the 6 star bond districts that we reviewed grew in quality of life industries survey respondents said they value. But of course, the numbers and types of industries varied by district. So pages 3 and 4 have some background information on what star bonds are, how they work, how frequently they've been used. It's actually fairly similar to TIF in the sense that there is a defined development district that the local government comes up with, and then they help support development within that district using, in this case, incremental sales tax revenue versus the primarily incremental property tax revenue that TIF uses. And of course, there is necessarily a bond involved until a very recent change, which you can see at the bottom of page 4. So there on the bottom of page 4, you'll see that since our last audit of this program, which was 2021, a few tweaks have been made, mostly expanding the types of projects that can be used, that can receive star bond financing. But I'm going to get to the top of page 5 here, and the reason why we looked at quality of life. So last time we reviewed this program was 2021, and we looked primarily at the tourism impact, because each district has to have a tourist attraction, and by our reckoning, that was the main purpose of the program. The Department of Commerce told us then, and told us more recently, that they also expect districts to improve local quality of life. And so in order to look at this in a different way, give you different information, not sort of repeat the same analysis, we decided to look at the quality of life effects. Now, they hadn't defined that or come up with a way to measure it on their own. So we went to economic literature and used some standard measurements to create our own methodology, which you will see on pages 5, 6, and 7. So flipping to page 6, figure 2, you'll see that we selected 6 districts to review in particular. They're the ones that are highlighted in blue. And we chose districts that were approved by Commerce between 2012 and 2023, and were open to the public, and were sort of mature projects by 2023. And we did that for data availability reasons. And then in order to evaluate how these districts changed in terms of their quality of life effects, you'll see at the top of page 7 that we evaluated how job density in 109 quality of life industries changed over the years between when Commerce approved these districts and 2023. So job density measures how many jobs in a given industry, so let's use the museum industry as an example, how many jobs in the museum industry there are relative to how many jobs there are total in all industries. So that gives you the proportion of jobs that are in a given industry, and it gives you some context by showing you how much of the jobs in a given area are in that industry versus all other industries, and then you can also do that calculation for the state level and show how the local area compares to the state. So what we wanted to do was see how these districts were changing in terms of the density of these specific 109 industries over time compared to the state. So critically, this is not just a measure of whether the jobs are going up or down, but how within the wider context of all industries and then relative to the state, these industries are changing, growing, shrinking, becoming more available or not, et cetera. And we'll get into some of the results in a minute. And then you can see at the bottom of page 7, top of page 8, that we compared those results to what survey respondents told us they cared about in terms of what affected their quality of life. So you see at the bottom of page 7, we surveyed people who were about to graduate. So this was back before May, people who were about to graduate in May of 24 from the 6 Kansas Board of Regents universities. We sent about 12,500 surveys to them and had a 6.2 response rate. So we cannot project their responses to all graduates in May of 24. And then Pitt State University and KU alumni associations also agreed to facilitate this survey for us with their alumni. So we surveyed 150,000 alumni from those institutions and got a 2.2% response rate. So again, not projectable. But what they told us aligned generally with the literature, so we're pretty confident that it reflects reality. Okay, let's flip to page 8, 9, and 10. We'll start getting into some of the survey results first. So one of the things we asked people, and you can see this in figures 3 and 4 on pages 9 and 10, is what made them decide to either stay in Kansas or leave Kansas. Some people had left already, some were planning to leave. Figure 3 outlines why people told us, survey respondents told us, they decided to leave Kansas. And you'll see that primarily this is for economic reasons. The top couple of responses are the job market, the pay available. The third one, critically, is amenities. So amenities do have a fairly large role to play in people's decisions to leave Kansas, and all of those types of responses align with the literature. Flipping to page 10, figure 4, the story is a little different for the people who stay. So you'll see that social factors play a bigger role in people deciding to stay in Kansas, and amenities are towards the bottom of the list. So they play a role, but not quite as strong of a role as people who decide to leave Kansas, and that also aligns with the literature. Page 10, page 11, we start getting into some of the results of our survey and how they align with some of the quality of life industry analysis. I'm going to go over that later on, actually. Bottom of page 11, these are just pure jobs numbers. So you'll see that the 6 districts that we reviewed all grew, just purely in terms of how many jobs they had. Primarily in quality of life industries, the 109 that we selected for review, but also in other industries. Okay, so let's flip to page 12, though, and get into the meat of the analysis. So this is where we stitch together the job density changes from the 109 quality of life industries that we isolated and reviewed, and the survey results in terms of people telling us what matters to their quality of life. So the types of industries we're looking at here are things like restaurants and retail stores of a variety of different types, theaters, sports stadiums, things like that, that generally increase people's satisfaction with where they live, according to the literature. So there's a series of figures here, 6, 7, 8, and 9 on pages 12 to 20 that kind of give you a high-level indicator of what we found. Let's go to figure 6. So these are the quality of life industries that grew most commonly in the 6 districts that we reviewed. And growth is indicated, this is job density growth again, is indicated through the blue boxes that are in the figure. And the darker the blue, the more impactful the growth. So the darkest blue, that's virtually black, is a new industry. So some industry that didn't exist before in the Starbond district or its local area, when Commerce approved the district, sprung up in the years that between then and 2023. And that's a new industry, and that's probably the most impactful in terms of changing people's quality of life. The dark blue is something that started below the statewide density. So I mentioned that we compared the density levels in these areas to the state, and if it started below the statewide density, it was like relatively unavailable compared to the state in the local area. And if it started there and then grew, that's also impactful. Not quite as impactful as a brand new industry, but more impactful than something that started at that statewide density, was already very common, but may have grown anyway, and that's the lightest blue. So you see that these are the industries that grew most commonly in the 6 districts. And if you compare that to what we see on the far right of the figure, you'll see that between 81 and 85% of survey respondents said these things mattered to them. It was important to their quality of life. So here we have fairly good alignment with growth and responses. So this is probably impacting people's quality of life in a positive way. Figure 7, on page 15, you'll see another group of industries that grew fairly commonly. These are related to breweries, tobacco stores, bars, things like that. These also grew fairly commonly, but as you can see on the far right of the figure, only about 50% of people who responded to the survey said this matters to them. So the impact here on people's quality of life, probably not so great. Page 16, figure 8, you'll see that there's a group of, or several industries here that were the most common, had the strongest responses in terms of being important to survey respondents' quality of life. You'll see at the far right of the figure that between 86 and 95%, so these were important industries. But looking at the figure, you also see that growth is much less common here. So we thought maybe these were missed opportunities to help influence people's quality of life in a positive way, because while they're quite important to people, they didn't grow that commonly. Page 18, you will see that there were several industries that grew very little. In fact, the transportation services related industries at the bottom of figure 9 didn't grow at all in any of the 6 districts. But you can also see at the right of this figure that only between 68 and 80% of survey respondents thought these industries were important to their quality of life. So the fact that there's not a lot of growth here probably doesn't impact people's quality of life, doesn't reflect a missed opportunity in the same way as some of the industries that had stronger responses but didn't grow all that much. Pages 18 and 19, you'll see that in general, when we asked survey respondents about the specific attractions, the tourist attractions that were in the 6 districts that we reviewed, whether they were important to their quality of life, they had primarily positive responses to that. Bottom of page 20, top of page 21. I want to point out that we don't know for sure what impact the Star Bond program actually had on the patterns that we are reviewing here. So all of this happened between when Commerce approved these programs and 2023. We don't know what role the Star Bonds program played in these changes. Most of the districts, Derby is the only exception to this, got other incentives in addition to Star Bonds, like CIDs. So disentangling the different programs' effects is virtually impossible. So we can't say which program caused these changes. But we think probably that the infrastructure and the aesthetic improvements that Star Bonds financed in these areas did contribute to the changes that we saw. The bottom of page 21, page 22, you'll see there some other findings. We reviewed Commerce's plan for implementing our 2021 recommendation, which was something that they said they were in the process of doing. And then at the bottom of page 23, actually middle of page 23 there, we did have another recommendation for Commerce related to this program, which was that they should define their quality of life goals for Star Bond districts and then measure whether districts meet these goals. And of course, how they choose to do that is up to them. So that is the result of our evaluation, and I will happily answer any questions.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have 3 questions. Number 1, the statute says, and maybe I just missed it entirely, that of course we have a description of the incentives, a literature review, and then an estimate of the incentives' economic and fiscal impact. That's not part of this at all.
The statute gives us wide latitude to define what that third question means. And so this does fall under what's allowed under the statute.
Okay, so I would just note that as a legislator, I would not have read that or understood that latitude in that, because from my perspective, I always want to know are the taxpayers' dollars giving us a return on investment? And that's why we keep coming back to these, is because we want to understand that. So I think that's good to understand that I'm misunderstanding that frame of what we've done, or somehow there's a disconnect in what we've written and what our expectations are and then what we're receiving back. My second question goes to quality of life. I don't have the statute for the Star Bonds in front of me. We just did that recently, but I'm sure Jason can provide it. But my question is, it says on page 5, Commerce officials said that although tourism matters, which is what we did, but last time we did the number of tourists inside and outside the state, it says improving local quality of life is also an important program goal. Was that program goal in statute?
statute defines the purpose of the program as the general and economic welfare of the state. And I suppose Commerce will have to speak more to this, but they must be, and actually our interpretation as well, would be that quality of life may fall under the general welfare of the state.
Okay, so they defined one of their goals as program goals based on our very general definition of STAR bonds, which is, again, something that we need to do better of tightening and being sure we set those goals. And then my final question relates to page 12. Page 12, in the middle of the page, it says, for instance, Derby District grew by 54% in all industries. Okay, so of course, if we have a district and we invest in a museum or a park, they're going to create jobs in that district. That's, I mean, I wouldn't need a study to know that you go from a field to, you're going to get that. But what my question is, and I'd like for us to consider this for the future, because I don't think there's anything in this, but maybe we can get that from Commerce, is if the district grew by 54%, how do the outlying areas change in job pattern? Did those, because we see it visibly all the time that there's a shift. We're not getting more people moving to Kansas. We're not really creating more jobs. We're seeing jobs shift from one location to the other. So we have this 54% growth in one area. The local area grew by 22%, but how much was lost outside that area or shifted from one area? And I don't think we can know that, can we?
We did not review that for this audit.
And again, Madam Chair, I feel like that is a missing piece of the puzzle that we've continually brought to Commerce. We don't know, and I don't know how we get those numbers, but I'm not feeling confident that all the economic incentive tools are doing what we want it to do, which is bring more people to Kansas and bringing job growth to Kansas outside of those jobs that already existed in different places. It's almost like we're just taking from other business owners. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. You did bring up an excellent point. There was a gentleman that used to be in legislative research, and his sister was a furniture store owner in Kansas City. And as soon as that Star Bonds project came in, almost every family store. So the work could be done to look at what businesses closed after that opened up. And that, you're right, that is the data that we need. Thank you. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Always like to hear these audits. These are great. If we could have our advisor also point us to the Star Bond statute. So when he has time, I'd like, so I don't have to go digging around for that one either. I didn't see grocery stores listed as, is that other retailers, or, because I didn't see any growth, because quality of life, if you're developing in an area and you want more people to live there, you need access to groceries. I didn't see that on the list anywhere. Not specific anyhow.
In Figure 8, the top group of industries is grocery and food stores and supercenters. We had a formatting issue in this version, and it should be in there. It may be the one that is showing up as a parenthetical that says, except convenience retailers. There's another line that's getting cut off. It's been fixed on the online version, okay. But regardless, it is not one of the ones that grew in the group of industries that we call grocery and food stores and supercenters.
Okay.
You're right.
And then I noticed a lot of these industries are like nail salons, stuff that, these are not high-paying jobs that we're necessarily drawing into. These are like service-type jobs, correct?
Many of them.
And then one other question would be, do we have any data on the number, how long the businesses survive who move into these Star Bond districts anticipating this increasing economic development and then go out of business? Because I'm aware in Village West, there's been a huge amount of turnover. There have been bankruptcies and things of that nature. we've got 3 stadiums out there, we've got a casino out there, and with the exception of the Nebraska Furniture Mart and Cabela's, which is now Bass Pro, you drive out there on a normal weekday, and it's a ghost town. So, I mean, do we have any kind of data on the survival rate of those businesses in that district? Is that part of this?
We didn't look specifically at business survival, but growth over time, job density growth over time would suggest that there is growth in these industries and that they must therefore be surviving. At least some of the businesses, whether the individual businesses are turning over and being replaced by others, or it's a single business that's persisting, the industry is staying there.
The type of industry?
The type of industry.
Maybe
right.
one restaurant replaced by another or something of that?
That's possible.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Jason?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the Star Bond statutes begin at KSA 12-17, 160 and following, and it is my understanding that the recent legislation that was passed during the special session regarding the professional sports team Star Bonds would likely be codified among those same statutes.
Thank you. So Andy, I have a couple of questions. One, on page 22, it says that Kansas and 2 other states have Star Bonds. I thought in a previous audit that those states are no longer using the Star Bonds. It's no longer in those other 2 states, that Kansas is the only one. Is that correct?
They still exist in those states, and in fact, so Nevada hasn't used theirs since our last evaluation, but Illinois has used theirs. When we last did that 2021 evaluation, they hadn't used it yet, but they have actually started their first project in Illinois.
So it is Illinois. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Also, on page 19, I thought the Prairie Fire Museum, that Star Bonds project was in a little bit of trouble. They're not selling enough product to pay for the bond. Is that correct?
They have not generated enough incremental sales tax to meet their bond debt obligation.
So where will that money come from then?
My understanding is that because statute prohibits the city from backstopping those bonds or the state, that the bondholders will simply be left with the debt, but the Department of Commerce may be able to speak to that as well.
But what I find interesting is on the survey, 64% and 75% said that those were not questioning your survey. I'm sure they returned those, but their actions aren't lining up with spending money in that area and saying that it's important. So I thought that was contradictory.
People visiting may or may not spend money. And so there's not necessarily a direct correlation between people thinking these are important and spending a significant amount of money there.
Okay, thank you. Senator Thompson.
Yeah, so, thank you, Madam Chair. So this was a survey of people who were visiting the area or just happened to be new people to the area? I want to get a sense of who it was you asked for the survey, just out of curiosity.
We outlined this on bottom of page 7. So it is students at the 6 Kansas Board of Regents universities who were set to graduate in May, and then alumni from Pitt State and KU.
So these are people that are purely looking at, I want some more bars to go to, I want some more entertainment, I want this, I want that, but they're not considering the true economic impact on the community, the taxpayers. They're just talking quality of life, as far as their quality of life, correct?
We asked them about their personal opinions about what contributes to their own quality of life. So whether they consider the economic effects of these types of industries, we don't know. But that wasn't something we explicitly asked them.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, any other questions? Thank you, Andy. We do have the Department of Commerce here, the City of Derby, and Salina City Manager. Anybody? Representative Williams.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would love to have Commerce Deputy Secretary Bob North?
Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee.
Yes, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions for you. On page 21, it says that Commerce officials said they don't interpret the 2021 change to require all previously approved Star Bond districts businesses to report visitation data. We can review that later with Jason, that we don't need to take up time on that. But my question is, did Commerce or does Commerce ever do geofencing? I mean, we have cell phone data. We could easily provide at least some type of data that would fulfill that need. Has that been done?
Yes, that has been done.
Okay, so that wasn't relayed in this? Because that does give.
Actually, I think that post-audit does talk about the software that our tourism division has and how we are using that to meet the recommendations that post-audit made in 2021.
Okay, but it says in here, they don't have the ability to require attractions.
Correct.
So maybe that.
You can't legally tell a city that issued Star Bonds 10 years ago, you've got to start reporting certain data. I agree, we don't have that ability, but we do have other tools that we can use and are using those.
And that would be a good thing to have added into the audit on that area so that we can understand that it's not just we can't do it, it's we can do it in other ways because we have that data. My next question for you, my last question is really, since we're looking at Star Bonds and, from our perspective, or at least from my perspective, it's that fiscal impact, it's that economic impact, it's that return on investment that's most important from my perspective. So do you have with you, or can you get that to our chair and to our committee, for our Star Bond, our active Star Bond districts in Kansas, what that base amount of sales tax is for those Star Bond districts, and then what that increment sales tax that was used to pay off the bonds for at least this year? It's always great to see multiple, but I would like to see that base amount for each district and what was raised so that we understand, again, this we talked about this in budget. We talked about that we have our revenues and expenditures when we're creating our appropriations budget, but we don't have one very important piece, and that's how much we're giving away. So and we still don't, by the way, Madam Chair, we still don't have that number, and I still can't go to the transparency database and go to any one program and see the totality of that expenditures for that year or since the program existed, unless I put it in an Excel doc and do a summation. Thank you.
Representative, we do provide that information about the sales tax base and the increment in our annual report, which is very widely distributed, and we'll happy to send you a copy of that. It has that number in it.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I want to say about that is we get reports, and I have gone over your reports. They're 100 pages sometimes. They're lengthy reports for every incentive. What I'm seeing, and I have gone over those, and there have been many things on those reports that I've just asked more and more questions on, and I could get buried in them. If I were a full-time employee in commerce, I'd probably have more time, but I'm not. I get paid $88.66 every time I show up. So my point on that is sometimes we ask specific requests. We don't want to go dig for that number. We ask for the specific request, and we would like, rather than just being pointed to a hyperlink or to give you a document, we're asking for specific, and that's what I've asked for. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and we will try to get that to you and get it emailed to you before the next meeting.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Representative Tarwater.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for being here. When we were talking about the Star Bond bill that went through, the subject of the failing Star Bond came up, and at that time you said you thought it was back on track. Could you still, can you confirm that it's now flush, or it's actually going to pay for itself? Or?
I don't know that flush is quite the right word, but it is producing enough sales tax currently that that it needs to make debt service on those bonds. So as we've discussed before, Prairie Fire got in a hole early in the lifetime of that project, and that's due to a grocery store leaving the district. It was due to some issues with the movie theater there. Those difficulties created a lag, a gap in revenue, but if you look at it today, there is sufficient sales tax revenue coming in to keep current on those bonds as they mature, which I think there's roughly another 10 years in that life of that district.
Thank you.
So a grocery store was in a star bond district? That's not the intent of what star bonds was for.
The grocery store
this
didn't
was
receive
before the
any,
law changed.
the grocery store didn't receive any star bond incentives, but grocery stores are in several star bond districts. And in fact, we can't, as a commerce department, keep a particular business from moving into a star bond district. I don't think we want to get involved in telling businesses where they can and can't locate.
Senator Thompson.
That does bring up a question. So we're talking about sales tax revenue going toward paying off that bond. Let me back up here. So what happens to say a prairie fire or one of these things never does pay for itself? Is it truly the bondholder that's stuck with this? And then, you know, we diverted all that sales tax revenue to paying off that bond. So that's an opportunity lost for other things. In other words, that thing goes bankrupt. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm just trying to figure out, you know, what is the end result if something fails in the star bonds district to the taxpayer? I mean, because you've got a empty building then, or lost jobs or whatever.
Sure. So the city and the state have no liability on a default in the star bonds. So that is solely the bondholder.
So do we pay a higher interest rate to those bondholders to assume that risk?
A higher rate than what?
Higher than normal. In other words, if you're on the hook for a bond, in most cases, nobody buys a bond expecting to have to assume that they want the return on the bond when it comes due. And so, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're not getting their money back. Do you?
Yeah, okay. I think I see where you're going, Senator. And so we were talking about TIF earlier. You were talking about TIF. And cities can put their full faith and credit behind TIF bonds. And so, yes, I would expect a full faith and credit bond from a city for a TIF project. It would have a different interest rate than a star bond would that a city cannot pledge its full faith and credit behind.
So there would potentially be a cost to the city if they have to purchase something to cover that in case it's not paid off by the star bonds?
No, cities by law cannot have a liability for that unpaid sales tax. I'm trying to distinguish between the interest rate on a bond that is backed by the full faith and credit of a taxing jurisdiction and a bond that is not.
So would you say that a failure in the star bonds would make it more difficult to attract people buying these bonds in the future? Or if they thought that it's not going to pay off?
Speculate to that. I think really without exception, obviously every project that has issued star bonds has been able to attract investors. Okay. I can say that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And is the Topeka Heartland, is that a star bond project that failed?
I don't, the legislature let the city of Topeka pledge its full faith and credit for those bonds. And so I do think over the history of that project that the city has had to supplement the sales tax revenue on those bonds. That's the only project that has that authority.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you. Thank you. Committee, we'll move on to our next agenda item, although I am going to break and call on Senator Ware.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't quite sure where my thoughts would fit in. Thank you. I would like at this time to withdraw my request for the audit of the hemp industry. Some things have changed. We've got other issues that we ought probably to be using the audit department's resources on. And so that would be my request.
Is that in the form of a motion?
Yes, it is. I move that we do that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a second on the motion? Senator Corson, it's been moved by Senator Ware, seconded by Senator Corson. Discussion on the motion. Representative Williams.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Can we have someone state what that audit question was?
Chris, do you mind? Thank you. Okay.
The title of the audit is Comparing Kansas's Hemp Requirements to Requirements in Other State. And the objective specifically is, how do Kansas's requirements related to growing hemp compare to requirements in other states and the federal government?
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will oppose this. I guess I don't understand why we wouldn't want to know that, but to save time, I would just say I oppose that motion. Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion? So mainly because I think I know that the state is going to start accepting the federal guidelines, so there will be no difference between the state and the federal. So I think I appreciate Senator Ware's diligence on this and saving the audit committee time. Senator Williams. Representative Williams.
I do that all the time too, so no worries. But so then what I'm understanding is that there are requirements right now that are, so we're putting the federal requirements aside, there are fees that Kansans pay, that Missouri state, or that the Missouri constituents don't pay. There are all kinds of regulatory requirements for our state that are not necessarily federally bound. And so wouldn't this have been helpful in that way? Per the question, it's looking at different state regulations. It wasn't just looking at federal. So again, I'm just a little bit confused.
Thank you. Well, my interest in generating this whole question was to benefit our hemp growers and to look at if there might not be a better system to look at. And the best one that we all found, and why most of the focus is on the USDA, the fees are much, much lower. There are some differences in the oversight. It just seems to be a much more reasonable way to go, and all the stakeholders are saying, yeah, let's do it that way. So I don't see a reason to continue to look at it that way.
So, and if I may, Senator Ware, you were the maker of the motion, the requester for the audit.
Yes, thank you, yeah.
So it's not that she's pulling somebody else's audit. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I still don't understand. I'm interested in this audit myself. I voted for. So every person that voted in favor of this audit is essentially a stakeholder in that audit, and now we're pulling it away. If I'm wrong that I heard that it is a review of state policy too, or is it only federal with this question? Kristen.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, so you're correct that it would include not just a review of it. Your question is not just a comparison to federal requirements, but other states.
Yes, and to me, and just one person, because I have somebody in my district that has spent thousands and thousands, if not more, close to 1 million on this, and I'm not the only one that has constituents, and there are state policies, Department of Ag, that have made it very difficult, and I don't think we've gotten anything through. And to understand the differences between what Missouri's doing and how successful they are compared to Kansas or any other state, regardless of what the federal law is, I guess I just am disappointed that this is thrown at us and that we're going to pull it when in reality there's still so much to learn. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I know exactly which constituent you're thinking of there. And honestly, the folks who are the most active in growing this whole industry are very much in favor of the changes that are virtually in play, and would be happy to let that go and to move to another system. And so it just kind of makes it all unnecessary.
Senator Ware, and I appreciate very much the motion. Would you mind if we just made it a lower priority for legislative post-audit and bump everything else up and then put this at the bottom of the list?
I guess that would be fine.
Okay.
I'm wondering does Ag have something to add?
Sure.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. So Senator Ware is correct. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to speak with you about this beforehand. The state of Kansas charged $1,200 fees for each licensee because we had to fund the program entirely out of our fee funds. The USDA in recent years, Missouri did this 2 years ago, Nebraska just did this, is offering a license at no charge and would have the same requirements as our state program. I cannot speak for the federal government as to how they're able to do that, but they have other sources of revenue that we do not have access to. So they will do the program the same way that we currently do the program. And we've been looking at this for a number of years, primarily because we still have a number of growers that are working very hard to make this a successful industry in the state of Kansas, but we went from over 200 licensees in the first 2 years, which would have really funded our entire program, to just about 40 licensees in the last 2 years, which is not enough licensees, even at $1,200 per license, to fund one full-time FTE. And we have reduced our FTEs to just one for this program so that we could try to prolong it as long as possible. But we have continued to look at the USDA, and after surrounding states have joined USDA and moved to having them do the day-to-day work of that program, we are moving in that direction as well. It definitely saves the growers money, but we don't want to have to come back to the legislature in 2 years and say, we actually cannot fund this program with fee funds anymore. We are going to have to ask for an appropriation from the legislature to fund the program. So that's why we're moving towards the USDA.
So no state funding on this, but right, no state fee. It would withdraw the fee. But I think there's going to be more questions than answers today. So if the good senator and, well, both good senators would mind withdrawing the second and the motion, and then we'll pick this up at the next meeting. Would that be okay? And then we'll make sure that these questions are answered and that we have the information before we take this vote. Would that be fine with the committee? Okay, great. Thank you. So consider them withdrawn. Thank you. I will call on Representative Probst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, the committee feels pretty feisty today, so I'm going to brace myself for this. I am going to make a motion to withdraw the Lay Caregiver Act audit. And the reason for this is that and I was the presenter of it. I asked for this. I will say there will be a subsequent motion, if this is approved, that I think will do a better job of addressing the issue. We've encountered basically an impasse in a legal area regarding HIPAA and whether we can actually get the information without violating HIPAA. There's some real concern about that. So I think I've talked with some other members of the committee, and I think, and some stakeholders in this, and I think a better approach, rather than try to force our way through with the audit, is to just pursue legislation. So I'll withdraw the audit and then make a request for some legislation.
So is that a motion?
That is a motion, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is there a second on the motion? Okay, it's been moved by Representative Probst, seconded by Representative Sawyer. Discussion on the motion. Representative Williams.
I am completely appalled. No, I'm joking. That sounds very reasonable.
Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Representative Probst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee. Now that we don't have the audit, I'd like to propose that the committee's revisers work with us on a conceptual bill draft. That would be a committee bill that would come from this committee that would allow us to create an oversight and enforcement mechanism regarding the Lay Caregiver Act.
Is that a motion? That is a motion. Okay. Is there a second on the motion? It's been moved by Representative Probst, seconded by Representative Sawyer. Discussion on the motion. Representative Williams, then Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess I'm so visual. I'm not sure what that question is going to really look like and how it compares to the other question. So are we actually voting to approve this conceptually, and then or are we just voting to have it brought to us and we're going?
We're voting to have it brought to us and work on. We're not voting on language or any approval of anything other than we are requesting a conceptual bill draft. Yeah. And the committee will get to see the final language before we move forward. But we do this, yeah. Senator Corson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And so we think this is going to get around the HIPAA problem is sort of why we're doing this path. We think that this is a better path as it relates to HIPAA.
Representative Probst.
Thank you. Yes, my initial thinking was that an audit would determine for us whether this was, some of the enforcement mechanism of the Lay Caregiver Act was a isolated problem, small problem, or a widespread problem. And since we've met this issue with the HIPAA conflict, creating some legislation that allows us to access that information, I think, is the way that we can address that.
Any other questions? Seeing none, those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you, committee. Next on the agenda is Chris. Committee operations. We just covered those. Sorry, guys. So you were, Senator Ware, you were on the agenda. I'm sorry. Chris.
If I could just have you turn to tab A in your notebooks. My part was just going to show you the schedule of upcoming audits. I believe it's in tab A. Yeah. That's, we've worked in the ones that you approved at the September meeting as best as possible. So this is how it's looking. The December meeting would have the Osawatomie State Hospital staff safety, the Commerce database, the new one on commerce background screening, a new one on soft warfare base 1.0 grants, the last two economic development incentives, and an IT security of KCC. And then the rest coming in January are slotting in after that.
This is helpful. Thank you, Chris. Committee, any questions? Okay. We'll move on to the next item. The KBI security audit.
Do you want me to make a motion?
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the committee recess this open meeting for a closed meeting pursuant to KSA 75-4319A to discuss matters relating to the security measures that protect the information systems of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and what the appropriate individuals that will be named under the justification listed in KSA 75-4319B 12C, because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures, to resume the open meeting in room 546S at 4:35. To record this motion if adopted in the minutes as part of the committee's permanent records. Make it 4:30? Okay, let me change that to 4:30 then. And then Chris is going to name the people that are going to be in the executive session.
Do we have a second on the motion? It's been moved by Representative Francis, seconded by Representative Williams. Discussion? We've never done that before, but all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Okay, thank you. Motion carries. We're in executive session. Good afternoon again, committee, we're back. We'll go ahead. The next item on our agenda is DCF follow-up with the TANF report. And I'd like to thank Madam Secretary for joining us and following up with the questions and the handout.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Not Madam Secretary, but Carla Whiteside Hicks. No, Director of Economic and Employment Services for DCF.
It's Secretary Howard. I apologize.
Not a problem.
I just promoted you. Sorry. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. So in response to some questions that you had the last time I was here, I did provide some additional information regarding our budget, carryover amounts, things like that, and then also the document that we got from Change and Innovation Agency that lists their recommendations for some opportunities that we have to make some improvements. And so I stand for any questions that you have.
So committee, we just saw just received the document. So I think it will take some time to digest it. I know it will for me. There's quite a bit of information in here. Does anybody have any follow-up questions for the director? No, I would thank you for coming again. We may at a later date, but right now, thank you for the information. And I would just like to acknowledge DCF. I don't, and you guys have very, very difficult situations to deal with, and we want the best results for Kansas. I think all of us agree on that. And I did reach out to the agency on a couple of issues this week, and it was very much appreciated that you guys can make some of these, our constituent issues, a priority. But hopefully Kansans don't have to call their legislator, that we can get the process working so that we are helping those in need. Thank you. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. So committee, I will turn to the consent calendar for Kristen, but before, I would like to compliment, again, Legislative Post Audit and their staff, including Cabe and Andy and everybody that presented today, and all of your work that you guys do. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes that we appreciate your efforts and keeping us informed. It helps us be better at our jobs. So thank you. Kristen?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So if you want to turn to tab B, that's where you'll see today's consent calendar memo, and there's just two things on it today. So that is approval of the minutes from your last meeting, which was September 10th. And you can find those in attachment A. And then there is acceptance of the performance audits presented today. So that includes both of the Ford County audits, the 2024 primary ballot reconciliation, and the 2022 general election. That is the TIF district audit, the Star Bonds audit, and then the IT security audit that you just heard.
Committee, is there any objection? Seeing none? It passes. Okay. Committee, that is the end of our agenda today, but we do need to discuss the next meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Normally, we meet in December for our schedule to produce those audits that are on that list I shared with you in tab A. Like mid-December would be great. Anytime after the 12th. So.
Committee, how would it be okay if Chris, if staff sent out an email again? And I think that seems to work best for finding a date for everyone. And it seems like the afternoon is most appreciated. So we'll try to meet in the afternoon, unless it's a full day. I don't know if you'll have a full day agenda. You may. Okay, we'll play it by ear then. How's that? Okay, committee, any other business to be brought before the committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned.